get on
I've
that?
seen this one. It's interesting.
I had one.
Welcome to History in Ashes. Tonight, you and I are stepping into a story that has shaped the world in ways you might not realize. Did you know that in Afghanistan, a movement of students, yes, young men who once sat in dusty classrooms with little more than Qurans and Kalashnikovs, managed to create one of the most feared regimes of the modern era? Did you know that by the late 1990s, this group controlled nearly 90% of Afghanistan, a landlocked country often dismissed by the outside world as peripheral? And yet, their decisions, their sheltering of fugitives, and their rigid interpretation of religion would eventually pull the United States, NATO, and much of the planet into a war that lasted for 2 decades. It is shocking to think that what began in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal, a time when Afghanistan was reduced to ruins and ruled by squabbling warlords, gave rise to a force that reshaped global security forever. Imagine a world where a forgotten village in Kandahar became the birthplace of policies that would ripple across oceans, alter airport security, and change how intelligence agencies everywhere operated. That is the story you are about to hear, told calmly, with all the dry yet essential details of how history really unfolds. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Could you scroll down to the comments and tell me where you are watching this from and what time it is there right now? I'm genuinely curious. History always feels a little different when told at midnight in New York than when whispered at sunrise in Delhi. And while you're there, could you also subscribe to History in Ashes? I know, asking you to subscribe might feel a bit like the Taliban telling young men in the 90s that they had to join their madrasa, but unlike them, I can't force you. Without your support, this channel will die quicker than a convoy cut off in the Afghan mountains. And trust me, I'd rather keep telling you these stories than let them fade into silence. When the Soviet Union finally retreated from Afghanistan in 1989, the country was not celebrating a true victory. Instead, it was fractured into territories carved up by warlords, each controlling dusty checkpoints and battered towns. Kabul, the capital, was bombed into skeletons of concrete. In the countryside, villages faced relentless cycles of looting, forced taxation, and raids. For ordinary Afghans, farmers who had spent their lives tilling rocky soil or herding sheep in high pastures, life was unbearable. They had endured 10 years of brutal Soviet occupation, and now they were caught in the crossfire of men who claimed to be liberators but acted as predators. It was in this void of governance that the Taliban found fertile ground. They emerged not with polished uniforms or foreign aid, but with an image of piety and discipline. Their leaders, many of them former Mujahideen fighters who had studied in Pakistani madrasas, presented themselves as incorruptible. They promised order at a time when law meant nothing. For weary Afghans, the sight of a group willing to hang bandits from roadside trees or burn down poppy fields seemed almost like relief. The Taliban's initial appeal was rooted not in ideology alone, but in the desperate hunger of people for stability, however severe. Imagine being a shopkeeper in Kandahar in the early 1990s. Every week, you paid off a different warlord's men. Your goods were looted at will. Travel even 20 miles meant passing through checkpoints manned by teenage gunmen, each demanding bribes or stealing outright. Then one day, a convoy of students with black turbans and worn sandals entered the city. They flogged a thief in the bazaar, executed a notorious commander, and announced that all roads would now be safe. For you, it wasn't about politics, it was about survival. Many Afghans quietly welcomed this strange force because it ended a cycle of chaos, even if it introduced a harsher rule. The origins of the Taliban cannot be understood without the refugee camps of Pakistan. Millions of Afghans fled across the border during the Soviet war. There, boys grew up in sprawling tent cities, often fatherless, their mothers relying on international aid to survive. In madrasas, they memorized scripture but learned little else. These boys, hardened by poverty and displacement, became the backbone of the Taliban. It was less about lofty theology and more about the only education and community they had ever known. The world at large barely noticed at first. In the 1990s, Afghanistan had slipped off the international radar. The Cold War had ended, the Soviets were gone, and Western capitals turned their attention elsewhere. But in those quiet years, a movement was taking shape, one that would eventually drag global superpowers back into Afghan valleys they had once sworn to leave behind. History often turns on details that seem boring in the moment. The grain prices in a Kandahar bazaar, the shifting alliances between tribal elders, the funding of madrasas by wealthy donors in the Gulf. But in these details, the Taliban story becomes clear. It was not simply about ideology, it was about survival in a shattered society where ordinary people clung to anything resembling order. And so I ask you this. When a population is so exhausted by lawlessness that they embrace even the harshest rule, is it truly a choice, or simply the last option left on the table? The boys who would become the backbone of the Taliban did not grow up with the luxuries of choice. They were born into refugee camps in Pakistan, living under tents that sagged in the rain and baked in the summer heat. For many, their fathers had been killed during the Soviet war, leaving their families dependent on meager international rations, bags of flour, powdered milk, and tins of oil stamped with the logos of distant charities. Their only access to education came in the form of madrasas funded by religious charities, where the emphasis was on memorizing scripture rather than teaching worldly skills. These young men learned little of mathematics, science, or languages. Instead, they carried verses and discipline as their only weapons against an uncertain future. By the early 1990s, a strange blend of resentment and purpose had taken hold. Many of these students, or Taliban as they were called in Arabic, saw their homeland consumed by warlordism. They looked across the border at Afghanistan and found no pride, only shame. The very commanders who had once fought the Soviets now exploited their own people. Villages were terrorized by militias demanding loyalty or tribute. Roads became hunting grounds where ordinary travelers were stripped of their belongings, and women faced dangers that went unspoken in public. For young men raised on strict discipline and the promise of a purer Islamic life, the corruption of their homeland felt intolerable. The Taliban began their march from Kandahar in 1994, a year that passed quietly in much of the world, but marked the beginning of a transformation for Afghanistan. In Kandahar itself, life was marked by desperation. Armed groups looted convoys carrying aid, and local commanders enriched themselves by trading in opium. Ordinary farmers, caught between survival and exploitation, found little protection in law or custom. When a local group of girls was kidnapped by a commander, villagers turned not to the government, because there was none, but to a small band of religious students led by Mullah Muhammad Omar. The Taliban responded by rescuing the girls and executing the guilty commander, a story that spread like wildfire through southern Afghanistan. Suddenly, people began to whisper. Here was a force that punished the wicked and offered something resembling justice. Their weapons were not superior to the warlords. Their numbers were not overwhelming. What made them different was their refusal to bargain with corruption. They fought not for personal gain, but to enforce a vision of moral order. however unforgiving it would soon prove to be. For Afghans who had lived through years of betrayal, that clarity was intoxicating. By the end of that year, the Taliban controlled Kandahar. Their takeover was marked by swift executions of criminals and a ban on practices they considered immoral. The bazaars were policed by young men who believed deeply in their cause, and within weeks, the once chaotic streets became unusually quiet. Merchants began to move goods again, caravans traveled without as much fear, and families found themselves able to leave their homes after dark. For many, it felt like the first taste of security since the Soviet invasion. Yet with this security came a new weight, the imposition of laws that were unyielding. The Taliban insisted on strict codes of dress, forbade women from working outside their homes, and punished even minor infractions with severity. Music was silenced, televisions smashed, and cultural practices that had flourished for centuries were suddenly forbidden. Still, in those early days, many Afghans considered the trade-off worthwhile. The cruelty of warlords had been replaced by something harsh but predictable. Predictability in a land ravaged by years of violence was a rare comfort. Outside Afghanistan, few paid attention. Western capitals still thought of Afghanistan as a footnote in Cold War history, a land of ruins and forgotten promises. But in the mosques and markets of southern Afghanistan, a new kind of rule was being written into daily life. This was not yet the Taliban that the world would come to know after September 11th, but the seeds were sown, the combination of discipline, uncompromising interpretation of faith, and a willingness to act where others faltered. Consider the perspective of a farmer in Helmand at that time. For years, he had been forced to pay bribes to different militias just to sell his crops. His sons had been conscripted into battles that served no cause beyond the ego of commanders. Suddenly, the Taliban arrived, burned the opium fields that had trapped farmers in debt, and declared that trade routes would be protected. For him, this felt like liberation, even though the same movement would soon dictate the color of his wife's clothing and the length of his beard. In this contradiction lies the complexity of the Taliban's rise. They were both rescuers and jailers, saviors and oppressors. By the mid-1990s, their influence had expanded rapidly. Provinces that had been divided for years fell under their control. Convoys of fighters rode in battered pickup trucks, armed with little more than determination and a few machine guns. They advanced not because they had overwhelming firepower, but because weary populations surrendered without a fight, believing that perhaps order, even harsh order, was better than none at all. And so, the Taliban's reputation grew, carried by word of mouth, fueled by frustration with endless warlordism. This was no polished army. It was a movement stitched together by shared experiences of poverty, displacement, and a burning sense of injustice. And within a few short years, they were on the path to Kabul itself. But here is the question that lingers. When a people are so desperate for security that they accept rule without mercy, does stability outweigh freedom, or does it merely mask a deeper kind of captivity? Daily life under the Taliban's first rule was marked by a mix of relief and suffocation. On the surface, the chaos of warlord feuds and endless looting seemed to vanish. Roads that had once been death traps for traders suddenly became passable again. Caravans of fruit, textiles and wheat began to move more freely. For the first time in years, a shopkeeper in Herat or Kandahar could leave his stall without constant fear of extortion. But the price of this new security was strict control over every corner of life. From the moment you stepped outside your door, you could feel the rules pressing against you. Men were expected to wear long beards and traditional clothing. Barbers who dared to offer a clean shave risked public humiliation or worse. Women faced the heaviest burden. They were confined almost entirely to their homes, forbidden from working or attending school. Those who ventured out had to wear the burqa, a garment that covered them head to toe with only a small mesh to see through. For many Afghan women, life shrank into a world of walls, their voices removed from the public sphere. The Taliban enforced these laws through the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, a name that carried both menace and irony. Its patrols wandered the streets armed with whips and sticks, ready to punish anyone who defied the rules. A boy caught listening to music might see his cassette tapes destroyed in the dust. A man accused of skipping prayers could be beaten in public. Markets that once hummed with songs and laughter fell silent, save for the sound of bargaining and the distant calls to prayer. For families, survival became a daily balancing act. A farmer in Helmand might welcome the Taliban's ban on highway robbery, but struggle with their destruction of poppy fields, which had been the only crop keeping his family fed. A teacher in Kabul found himself jobless when schools for girls were shuttered and the curriculum for boys reduced almost entirely to religious instruction. Small acts of resistance, like reading a forbidden book in secret or listening to a smuggled radio broadcast, carried enormous risks. Yet, it is important to remember that not all Afghans experienced Taliban rule in the same way. Some rural communities, already accustomed to conservative traditions, found the changes less jarring than city dwellers. In villages where women had rarely gone to school before, the Taliban's bans seemed like a continuation of custom. But in Kabul, where women had once studied at universities and worked as doctors or journalists, the sudden erasure of freedoms felt like stepping back centuries. Internationally, the Taliban's policies began to draw attention. Images of public punishments in stadiums shocked the outside world. Executions, amputations, and floggings were staged as demonstrations of justice. For Afghans, attending these grim spectacles was not optional. Crowds were often forced to watch, a reminder that the rules were absolute and disobedience carried a price. Ordinary people adjusted in quiet, practical ways. Families relied more heavily on underground networks to teach girls in secret schools hidden inside homes. Traders smuggled goods banned by the authorities, like tapes of popular music or cosmetics, and sold them quietly behind closed doors. Some Afghans embraced the Taliban's codes as a path to religious purity, while others simply learned to live small, silent lives, hoping to avoid the attention of the enforcers. For children growing up in the late 1990s, the world was one of silence and shadows. Their education was reduced, their entertainment banned, their futures narrowed. And yet, in the midst of this, daily life went on. Farmers still ploughed their fields, families still shared meals, and weddings were still celebrated, though stripped of music and dance. Even under the strictest rule, human life found ways to continue, adapting to the narrow space that remained. The world saw the Taliban as harsh rulers, and they were, but to many Afghans the question was never about choice. It was about endurance. When every alternative meant either chaos or foreign occupation, the Taliban's order, no matter how suffocating, was often tolerated. So here is the thought that lingers. When people adjust their lives to survive under such rule, does that adaptation count as acceptance? Or is it simply the quiet art of surviving history's cruelty? By the late 1990s, the Taliban were no longer just a curious local force. They had become rulers of most of Afghanistan. Their control spread outward from Kandahar like ripples across water, eventually reaching Kabul in 1996. That moment was pivotal, not just for Afghans, but for the entire world. What had begun as a student movement promising to end warlord abuses had transformed into a government, one that claimed the right to represent Afghanistan on the global stage. When their fighters marched into Kabul, they did so with little resistance. The city was exhausted after years of bombardment by competing militias, each one shelling neighborhoods to seize control. The Taliban's entrance was marked by a brutal display, the capture, castration, and public hanging of former President Najibullah, who had been hiding in a UN compound. His body was dragged through the streets, a gruesome message that the old order was gone. For many Afghans, the sight was horrifying. For others, it confirmed that the Taliban was serious about erasing the corrupt past. Kabul under Taliban rule quickly changed. Universities closed to women. Offices were emptied of female workers. Public executions and amputations became spectacles staged in stadiums that once hosted soccer matches. The capital, once a city of vibrant culture and cautious optimism during earlier decades, fell into silence. And yet, despite these conditions, the Taliban government sought legitimacy abroad. This is where Pakistan enters the story in a decisive way. Pakistan had been deeply involved in Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion of 1979. Its intelligence agency, the ISI, had supported Mujahideen groups during that war, funneling money and weapons provided by the United States and Saudi Arabia. After the Soviets withdrew, Pakistan faced a problem. Afghanistan remained chaotic, and without a stable government, Pakistan's ambitions of gaining strategic depth against India looked impossible. The Taliban, with their discipline and roots in Pakistani madrasas, seemed like the perfect solution. They were Pashtun, like much of the Afghan population, and their leaders had lived in exile across the border. Pakistan offered them arms, training, and logistical support. Pakistani truck convoys, often escorted by Taliban fighters, carried goods across the highways, reopening trade routes that had long been closed by insecurity. For Islamabad, backing the Taliban was not just about religion, it was about geopolitics, securing influence in Kabul and ensuring that Afghanistan did not align with India or rival factions. Beyond Pakistan, other nations also noticed. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates extended recognition to the Taliban regime, partly out of shared religious ideology and partly to maintain influence in a region that mattered for strategic and economic reasons. Only 3 governments in the world formally recognized the Taliban as Afghanistan's rulers: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. For most of the international community, the Taliban's human rights abuses were too glaring to ignore. Yet recognition, or lack of it, didn't mean disengagement. Aid agencies, journalists, and intelligence officers continued to operate, attempting to navigate the strange world of a state ruled by clerics and enforced by religious police. Daily life under this new international reality remained paradoxical. On the one hand, the Taliban secured trade routes and reopened certain commercial activities, particularly with Pakistan. Trucks filled with Pakistani goods moved into Afghan markets, while Afghan raw materials, such as fruit, wool, and even opium, found their way across the border. For ordinary traders, this meant business could resume, even under tight restrictions. On the other hand, the Taliban's policies kept Afghanistan isolated. Women were barred from working with international organizations, crippling the delivery of healthcare and education. Restrictions on media and communication made coordination with the outside world nearly impossible. The Taliban's relationship with Saudi Arabia was more complex than it first appeared. Saudi donors had long funded madrasas in Pakistan where many Taliban members had studied, and there were ideological ties through a shared conservative vision of Islam. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Taliban's destruction of Afghanistan's cultural heritage, including the eventual demolition of the Bamiyan Buddhas, horrified much of the Muslim world, including many Saudis. And their growing association with al-Qaeda, whose leader Osama bin Laden resided in Afghanistan under their protection, made them increasingly controversial even among their few allies. Still, for a time, the Taliban seemed confident. They held press conferences, invited foreign journalists, and attempted to present themselves as legitimate rulers, though their words often clashed with the brutal reality on the ground. Mullah Omar, their reclusive leader, rarely appeared in public, but his voice carried weight, especially after he was given the title Amir al-Mu'mineen, Commander of the Faithful. This was not just a political claim, it was a religious one, suggesting that he held authority over Muslims beyond Afghanistan's borders. For many outside observers, this was alarming, a sign that the Taliban saw themselves as more than a local power. One of the overlooked but deeply significant aspects of this period was the flow of refugees. Afghans continued to flee into Pakistan, Iran, and beyond, seeking education, work, and safety that their homeland could not provide. In dusty border camps, entire generations grew up with no experience of stability. These communities became both symbols of Afghanistan's suffering and sources of new recruits for militant groups. The international community often debated how to handle the humanitarian crisis, but little was resolved. Aid flowed inconsistently, and sanctions imposed on the Taliban government only deepened the hardships for ordinary people. For Afghans living in Kabul, Herat, or Kandahar, the international maneuverings meant little compared to daily struggles. A widow in Kabul, barred from working, relied entirely on begging or the secret charity of neighbors. A doctor trained in earlier decades now found himself forbidden from treating female patients unless another male relative was present. Schools that once buzzed with ambition for both boys and girls were now stripped to bare lessons, taught in crumbling buildings by teachers who themselves lived in poverty. These are not the grand moments of history you read in headlines, but they are the daily details that reveal how international politics translates into human endurance. Meanwhile, Afghanistan became increasingly entangled in the global web of militancy. Bin Laden's arrival in the mid-1990s, welcomed by the Taliban, signaled a shift. For Pakistan, this alliance was useful but dangerous. It risked turning Afghanistan into a target of international pressure. For Saudi Arabia, it created embarrassment, as one of its most infamous citizens operated openly from Afghan soil. For the West, it was a warning, though at first an ignored one, that Afghanistan was becoming a safe haven for transnational terrorism. And yet, despite these developments, much of the outside world still regarded Afghanistan as peripheral. Conflicts in the Balkans, economic crises in Asia, and political changes in Europe consumed attention. Afghanistan was often relegated to the margins of foreign policy discussions, considered too remote, too fragmented, too hopeless to resolve. The Taliban's interactions with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and a few other states seemed like regional concerns rather than global threats. It is easy, in hindsight, to imagine that the world should have seen what was coming, but history rarely announces its turning points clearly. In the late 1990s, Afghanistan under the Taliban looked to many like a tragedy confined within its borders. The warnings were there: refugee flows, human rights abuses, the presence of international militants, but they blended into the background noise of a world preoccupied with other crises. For Afghans themselves, however, the reality was stark. The Taliban promised purity but delivered isolation. They claimed stability but enforced silence. They sought recognition abroad but treated their own citizens as subjects to be ruled with fear. It was a paradox the world did not resolve, and one that would grow more dangerous with every passing year. So here is the question worth pondering. When the world notices a regime that suppresses its own people, yet seems distant from immediate global interests, is ignoring it an act of pragmatism, or the first step toward a crisis that will eventually spill across every border? By the late 1990s, Afghanistan had become more than just a forgotten country on the fringes of international concern. It was a hub, quietly drawing in figures who would change the course of world history. Among these was Osama bin Laden, a man already infamous in intelligence circles long before the wider public knew his name. His arrival in Afghanistan under Taliban protection tied the fates of two movements together, one local, rooted in the soil and struggles of Afghanistan, and the other global, determined to strike at the faraway power of the United States. Bin Laden had once been celebrated by many in the Arab world as a wealthy Saudi who had joined the Mujahideen during the Soviet War. He funded fighters, built infrastructure, and positioned himself as both warrior and benefactor. But by the early 1990s, he had broken with his homeland. Expelled from Saudi Arabia and later Sudan, he needed a safe haven. Afghanistan under the Taliban, isolated from the world, yet still accessible through sympathetic networks in Pakistan and the Gulf, offered him exactly that. When he returned in 1996, the Taliban were consolidating power. At first, his presence was tolerated more than celebrated. He was valuable, bringing money, prestige, and trained Arab fighters, but he was also a risk. The Taliban's leadership, particularly Mullah Omar, did not fully grasp the scale of bin Laden's global ambitions. Their focus remained primarily Afghan, consolidating their rule, enforcing their laws, and seeking legitimacy abroad. But bin Laden and his organization, Al-Qaeda, had their eyes set far beyond the mountains of Kandahar. In 1998, the world began to notice. Two massive bombings struck American embassies in East Africa, one in Nairobi, Kenya, and another in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The attacks killed hundreds of people, many of them ordinary passers-by who had no link to global politics. Responsibility was claimed by Al-Qaeda, and the United States responded with missile strikes against training camps in Afghanistan. The Taliban, now directly implicated by harboring bin Laden, were faced with a choice: surrender him and risk losing their ally, or protect him and deepen their isolation. They chose the latter. For ordinary Afghans, these geopolitical games rarely translated into relief from their daily struggles. Bombings abroad and threats of intervention seemed distant compared to the grinding reality of survival under Taliban rule. A mother in Kabul still faced the same restrictions when trying to seek medical care. A farmer in Helmand still watched his poppy fields burned, even as opium continued to circulate through clandestine networks. The presence of foreign militants added little to the lives of common people, except perhaps new dangers when America's missiles occasionally lit up the night sky. The relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban was complicated. Bin Laden pledged loyalty to Mullah Omar, recognizing him as Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the faithful. This pledge gave the Taliban not only resources but also prestige among radicals abroad, yet it also tied them to al-Qaeda's violent ambitions. For Taliban leaders, who were often insular and uninterested in the faraway West, bin Laden's vision was almost incomprehensible. Why would anyone seek to attack New York or Washington, cities most Taliban fighters could hardly imagine? And yet, by offering him sanctuary, they unknowingly tied their fate to his. The years leading up to September 11th were marked by a strange duality. On one hand, the Taliban tried to strengthen their rule domestically, enforcing strict social codes and attempting to govern a fragmented country. On the other, they increasingly became host to networks of foreign fighters, training camps, and plots that extended well beyond Afghanistan's borders. Western intelligence agencies grew increasingly alarmed, but intervention remained hesitant. Sanctions were imposed, diplomatic pressure increased, but the Taliban did not bend. They either underestimated the seriousness of the warnings or believed their isolation insulated them from outside consequences. In the villages and towns, life continued in its harsh rhythm. Weddings without music, schools without girls, streets without color. Yet whispers traveled about Arab fighters training in the mountains, about foreigners who came and went with ease, about camps hidden in valleys where men prepared for wars most Afghans neither understood nor wanted. For local people, these rumors were just another layer of strangeness in a land already saturated with hardship. And then came the turning point. On September 11th, 2001, al-Qaeda struck the United States in a series of coordinated attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people. The world changed overnight. For Americans, the Taliban were no longer a distant curiosity. They were the rulers who had given sanctuary to those responsible. The patience of the international community vanished and war loomed. But before we follow the story into those mountains and battlefields, I need to pause for something lighter. If you've made it this far into the story and still haven't subscribed to History in Ashes, could you please do it now? Without your support, this channel will disappear faster than the Taliban's grip on Kabul in 2001. It takes only a click, and unlike the Taliban's decrees, you actually do have a choice here. And honestly, I'd rather you join willingly than by force. Now back to the history. The Taliban had bound their future to bin Laden without realizing how heavy the chain would become. Their sheltering of al-Qaeda had transformed them from local rulers into global enemies. The storm that was about to sweep into Afghanistan would not only topple their regime, but plunge their country into another 2 decades of war. So let me leave you with this question. When leaders choose loyalty to allies over the survival of their own state, are they acting out of principle, or are they walking blindly into the collapse of everything they have built? The morning after September 11th, 2001, the world's gaze turned sharply toward Afghanistan. For years, the Taliban had been a subject of concern, but not of urgent action. Suddenly, they were at the center of the greatest crisis of the new century. The images of collapsing towers in New York and a burning Pentagon in Washington reshaped global politics overnight. In the days that followed, the United States issued an ultimatum: surrender Osama bin Laden and dismantle al-Qaeda's presence, or face war. The Taliban, led by Mullah Omar, refused, whether out of loyalty, pride or a profound miscalculation, they chose defiance. Their spokesman argued that bin Laden was a guest, protected under Afghan traditions of hospitality. They requested evidence of his guilt, but the United States, enraged and grieving, dismissed negotiations as stalling tactics. The course was set. In October 2001, American bombers flew over Afghan skies, marking the beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom. For ordinary Afghans, the sudden rain of bombs was both terrifying and strangely familiar. Their land had known invasions before, the British in the 19th century, the Soviets in the late 20th. Once more, villages became battlefields, families fled across borders, and the sound of warplanes echoed through valleys that had long survived on little more than silence and prayer. But unlike earlier invasions, this one came with global force. The United States assembled a coalition of NATO allies and regional partners, while Afghan warlords who had once fought the Taliban resurfaced under the banner of the Northern Alliance, eager to reclaim lost power with American backing. The collapse of Taliban rule was astonishingly swift. Within weeks of bombing campaigns and coordinated ground offensives, the regime crumbled. Kabul fell in November 2001 as Northern Alliance fighters, supported by American special forces, entered the capital. Taliban officials fled south toward Kandahar or into Pakistan. Mullah Omar himself disappeared, a shadow slipping across the border or into the mountains, leaving no trace that could be confirmed. To many in the outside world, it seemed the Taliban were finished, erased as quickly as they had risen. Celebrations erupted in Kabul, where women tore off their burqas in public squares. Music returned to markets, and once banned cinemas reopened. The Western press declared the end of medieval tyranny, painting the war as a clean break between darkness and light. Aid organizations rushed in, promising reconstruction, schools, and hospitals. For a brief moment, it appeared as though Afghanistan might finally step into a new era. Yet the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The Taliban had vanished from the cities, but they had not disappeared. Fighters melted into the rural countryside, blending back into their villages, or retreating into the rugged terrain of southern Afghanistan and the tribal areas of Pakistan. These mountains and deserts were not just landscapes, they were survival tools. For centuries, Afghans had resisted empires by retreating into these natural fortresses. The Taliban now did the same. Meanwhile, the sudden empowerment of the Northern Alliance brought back memories of the brutal civil war years. Old commanders returned to positions of authority, some resuming practices of corruption and intimidation. Afghans, who had once turned to the Taliban to escape warlord abuse, now found themselves under the same figures who had terrorized them in the early 1990s, this time wearing the mantle of allies of the West. The promises of liberation clashed with the persistence of old wounds. In Washington, the Taliban's collapse was hailed as a victory. President George W. Bush spoke of freedom advancing, of women liberated, of terrorism uprooted. Yet in Afghan villages, people quietly questioned what had truly changed. Yes, music played again, and girls returned to classrooms. But alongside this, progress came foreign troops, drone patrols, and raids that often targeted the wrong homes. Families who had endured Taliban beatings now endured the trauma of bombs that missed their mark, or soldiers who distrusted every villager. One of the understated but crucial elements of this period was the Taliban's reliance on survival networks. In rural Afghanistan, kinship ties run deep, and tribal codes often place loyalty to family and guest above allegiance to state or ideology. A Taliban fighter returning to his home village was not necessarily welcomed because of politics, but because tradition demanded it. Providing food or shelter to a guest, even a fugitive, was a cultural obligation. In this way, the Taliban dissolved back into society, invisible to outsiders, but never gone. At the same time, Pakistan's border regions became sanctuaries. In cities like Quetta, Taliban leaders regrouped quietly, often under the watchful but ambiguous gaze of Pakistani authorities. For Islamabad, the situation was delicate. On one hand, Pakistan was a declared ally in America's war on terror. On the other, abandoning the Taliban outright risked losing influence in Afghanistan to India or other rivals. Thus, in the shadows, networks of support remained intact, even as Pakistan publicly pledged cooperation with Washington. The early collapse of the Taliban exposed a flaw in international thinking, the belief that military defeat meant political death. In reality, the Taliban were less a traditional army than a movement rooted in community and identity. Their fall from power did not erase the grievances that had once fueled their rise. Rural Afghans still suffered poverty, corruption, and abuse at the hands of local power brokers. Foreign intervention, though initially welcomed by some, quickly produced its own scars. By 2002, while the world's attention began shifting toward Iraq, Taliban fighters were already testing the waters of insurgency. Small groups launched ambushes on convoys, planted roadside bombs, and intimidated villagers who cooperated with the new government. These acts were often dismissed as remnants, dead-enders, as some American officials called them. But beneath the surface, a long war was brewing, one that would stretch for 2 decades and cost countless lives. For Afghans themselves, the years immediately after the Taliban's collapse were contradictory. In the cities, optimism flourished, schools reopened, elections were promised, and international aid flowed in. In the countryside, suspicion lingered. Foreign troops were strangers, speaking unfamiliar languages, moving with convoys of armored vehicles. Local elders were courted with money and promises, but the deep fractures of Afghan society could not be mended overnight. Looking back, the sudden fall of the Taliban in 2001 was not the end of their story, but the beginning of another chapter. They had been removed from power, but not from the land. Their retreat was less a defeat than a transformation, from rulers into insurgents, from a visible government into a shadowy force waiting for time to shift in their favor. And so the question remains, when a movement rooted in the soil of its people is toppled by outside force, does its collapse mark true defeat, or merely the planting of seeds that will grow again once the storm passes? By the year 2003, Afghanistan seemed outwardly calm, at least to foreign observers. A new government had been installed in Kabul under Hamid Karzai. The international community pledged billions for reconstruction, and Western leaders spoke of democracy taking root in Central Asia. But outside the capital and beyond the reach of foreign embassies, another reality was unfolding, one that would shape the future of the Taliban's survival. The countryside was where the Taliban had always drawn strength, and now, stripped of official power, they leaned even more heavily on it. Villages in southern provinces such as Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan became havens where fighters could disappear into the folds of family and tribal ties. They no longer wore uniforms or carried banners. Instead, they blended into farmers, shepherds, and traders. A man who tended goats by day might, by night, quietly carry out an ambush against a government patrol. This dual life became the cornerstone of Taliban resilience. Rural Afghanistan is defined by geography as much as by politics. Endless mountain ranges, arid deserts, and labyrinthine valleys make surveillance difficult. To foreign troops, villages often looked alike. Mud brick homes built from the very soil they sat upon, connected by paths that twisted through fields and irrigation canals. Locals knew every bend in the land, every hidden pass, and every dry riverbed where a convoy could be trapped. This intimate knowledge gave the Taliban an advantage that no amount of advanced technology could erase. Meanwhile, foreign aid poured into the country but often vanished into the pockets of middlemen, contractors, and corrupt officials. Roads were promised but left incomplete. Schools were built but without teachers. Clinics opened without medicine. For ordinary Afghans, promises of progress began to ring hollow. The Taliban, watching closely, seized on this disillusionment. They began to rebrand themselves not only as fighters, but as protectors of tradition and religion, contrasting themselves against what they portrayed as corrupt elites propped up by outsiders. Another element of survival was propaganda. The Taliban became skilled at using rumors, whispered stories, and later even cassette tapes and CDs to spread their message. Villagers heard tales of foreign soldiers disrespecting Islamic customs or government officials stealing aid. Some of these stories were true, others exaggerated, but all served to nurture distrust of the Kabul government and its allies. In societies where literacy was rare, word of mouth carried immense power, shaping perception more effectively than any written policy. Pakistan played a complex role in this survival. While Islamabad publicly allied itself with Washington, the porous border allowed Taliban fighters to move back and forth with relative ease. Safe havens in places like Quetta gave leadership time to reorganize, raise funds, and plan operations. The so-called Quetta Shura, an informal council of Taliban leaders, quietly kept the movement alive, guiding strategy while letting local commanders act independently. Finances, too, became a crucial lifeline. Afghanistan's opium trade, already thriving in the southern provinces, became intertwined with Taliban survival. Taxing farmers, protecting smuggling routes, and skimming profits from traffickers provided steady revenue. While the West spoke of cutting off terrorism financing, the reality was that the Taliban tapped into one of the most resilient and lucrative underground economies in the world. For villagers, opium was not ideology but livelihood, and if the Taliban protected that livelihood, their presence was tolerated, even welcomed. Daily survival strategies extended to the most basic acts of blending in. Taliban fighters grew their beards like every other villager, wore the same loose clothing, and carried prayer beads. They hid weapons in irrigation ditches, behind walls, or under animal fodder. In many cases, they relied not on force, but on persuasion. Elders were approached respectfully, offered gifts, or promised protection. To betray the Taliban to foreign troops meant risking retaliation, but also defying traditions of loyalty and kinship. Few were willing to take that risk. At the same time, American and NATO troops, though powerful, often struggled to distinguish friend from foe. Convoys rolled through dusty villages, searching homes and detaining men on suspicion. Some were guilty, but many were not. A single mistaken raid could alienate an entire village, driving families who might have been neutral into the arms of the Taliban. These quiet resentments became the soil from which insurgency grew. By 2004, Taliban attacks became more organized. Roadside bombs, known as IEDs, became their weapon of choice, cheaply made but devastatingly effective against armored vehicles. Suicide bombings, once rare in Afghan culture, began appearing with increasing frequency, often carried out by young men convinced or coerced that martyrdom would bring honor. Each act served not only as military resistance, but also as psychological warfare, reminding Afghans and foreigners alike that the Taliban had not vanished. And through it all, ordinary Afghans bore the heaviest burdens. Farmers planting wheat risked stepping on mines. Children walking to school feared crossfire between insurgents and soldiers. Women fetching water navigated landscapes where every stranger might be a fighter or a spy. Survival meant constant calculation, who to trust, when to speak, when to remain silent. For many, neutrality was the only shield, though it grew thinner with each passing year. The Taliban's survival during these years was not inevitable, but it was deeply tied to Afghanistan's history of resilience against outsiders. Empires had come before with more soldiers and more resources, yet the mountains and valleys had always outlasted them. The Taliban, drawing from this legacy, adapted themselves into a force that did not need to hold cities or display flags. They needed only to persist, to wait, to wear down their enemies until time itself turned in their favor. It raises a sobering question. When a movement becomes inseparable from the rhythms of daily life, when it hides not in barracks but in homes, fields, and prayers, how does an outsider ever truly defeat it? By the middle of the 2000s, the Taliban were no longer a scattered remnant, but an organized insurgency. What had begun as scattered ambushes and improvised attacks slowly expanded into a coordinated campaign across large parts of Afghanistan. Foreign soldiers, once moving confidently through dusty valleys, began to travel in convoys of armored vehicles. Helicopters hovered constantly above outposts. Bases ringed with barbed wire and guard towers became islands of foreign control in a sea of rural distrust. The Taliban adapted quickly. Their fighters no longer concentrated in mass battles, but instead fought a war of attrition. Roadside bombs grew in size and sophistication, sometimes tearing through heavily armored vehicles with devastating effect. Convoys were halted by explosions, only to be followed by sudden gunfire from hidden positions. This pattern, attack, vanish, and blend into the population, frustrated NATO troops who found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. In many districts, the Taliban created shadow governments. They appointed their own judges, tax collectors, and administrators. In villages where Kabul's influence was weak, Taliban courts offered swift rulings, often based on strict interpretations of Islamic law. While harsh, they were predictable and, in many cases, less corrupt than government-appointed judges who demanded bribes. For poor farmers, predictability often mattered more than ideology. If a dispute over land could be settled without months of waiting or costly appeals, the Taliban's authority became, if not legitimate, at least functional. The Afghan government, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of corruption. Funds from foreign donors often disappeared before reaching their intended targets. Construction projects stalled or collapsed. Ghost schools, buildings listed on government reports but never built, became symbols of squandered opportunity. In Kabul, politicians debated constitutions and elections, while in rural Helmand, a farmer still worried whether he would survive the next day's airstrike or insurgent attack. NATO forces tried to win hearts and minds through reconstruction efforts, but military priorities often overshadowed development. Villagers who received aid one day might see their homes raided the next if suspected of sheltering fighters. Each mistake hardened resentment. A night raid in one valley might kill an insurgent, but if it also killed his family members, dozens of others became enemies. The Taliban knew this, and they positioned themselves as the defenders of Afghan honor against foreign intrusion. One of the most significant shifts during this period was the Taliban's embrace of media. Once dismissive of modern communication, they now used video recordings, websites, and later social media to broadcast their narrative. Images of attacks against foreign troops were circulated as proof of resistance. Messages urged Afghans to reject Kabul's government and reminded them of foreign occupation. What had once been a rural insurgency now carried its voice across borders and into global consciousness. The human cost of this escalation was immense. By 2006, civilian casualties were rising. Suicide bombings targeted markets and buses, killing ordinary people alongside soldiers. Families who had survived Soviet tanks now lived in fear of both Taliban retribution and NATO air power. Teachers who dared to educate girls received death threats. Some were murdered. Aid workers were kidnapped. Each act of violence rippled outward, eroding trust, paralyzing development, and deepening despair. Yet beneath the violence, daily life persisted. Farmers still tilled fields, traders still carried goods by donkey across mountain passes, families still gathered for meals in courtyards lit by lanterns. Survival demanded continuity, even in chaos. Parents whispered to their children stories of quieter times, even as the thud of distant artillery echoed through the night. It is in these ordinary moments that history often hides, not in the battles themselves, but in the resilience of those who live through them. The Taliban's growing influence also revealed a paradox. Foreign powers could control cities and highways, but control of the countryside, where most Afghans lived, was slipping. Villages became laboratories of governance where the Taliban tested their authority. If they could provide justice, security, and income, however strict or violent, the government in Kabul struggled to compete. By 2007, their shadow courts, tax systems, and local militias functioned in dozens of districts. It was not just insurgency, it was parallel statehood. This reality forced a question upon the international mission. Was Afghanistan being stabilized, or was it being partitioned into zones of fragile control? The Taliban were not marching on Kabul in columns of tanks, but they were eroding legitimacy, district by district, family by family. Each alliance they forged in a village, each promise they kept to a farmer, and each grievance they exploited against Kabul built a foundation for their eventual resurgence. And so, by the late 2000s, the war had shifted from a narrative of victory to one of endurance. NATO sought milestones, elections held, provinces secured, roads paved, while the Taliban measured success in patience. To them, every year that foreign troops stayed was a year of bleeding resources, a year closer to exhaustion. Time itself became their ally, the silent weapon that no drone could destroy. So one is left to wonder, when a war stretches not over months but decades, is power determined by firepower or by the ability to outlast your enemy's will to stay? By the year 2009, the war in Afghanistan had reached a turning point. What had once been described as a quick campaign to remove the Taliban had transformed into the longest war in modern American history. The Taliban, once thought to be broken, were resurging with force, launching increasingly deadly attacks, reclaiming rural territories, and extending their reach into provinces once considered secure. The United States and NATO responded with a surge of troops. Tens of thousands of additional soldiers were deployed, making convoys of armored vehicles and helicopters a constant presence across Afghan skies. Bases multiplied, stretching into provinces like Helmand and Kandahar, where the Taliban's roots ran deepest. The strategy was to clear, hold, and build, push the Taliban out, secure territory, and win the loyalty of the population through development. On paper, it sounded plausible. On the ground, it collided with the complexity of Afghan life. Villagers often faced impossible choices. Cooperating with NATO forces might bring roads or wells, but it also invited Taliban reprisals. Offering the Taliban shelter provided protection from insurgent punishment, but risked government raids or airstrikes. Families calculated daily which danger was closer, which risk was survivable. Neutrality, once the safest path, became more dangerous as both sides demanded loyalty. The Taliban intensified their use of improvised explosive devices. These roadside bombs evolved from crude devices into sophisticated traps, sometimes hidden in culverts, sometimes triggered by pressure plates, sometimes detonated remotely. Armored vehicles once thought impenetrable were ripped apart in seconds. Patrols slowed to a crawl, each step forward shadowed by fear of the unseen. The very roads meant to connect Afghanistan became death traps. Suicide bombings multiplied as well. Markets, police stations, even foreign embassies became targets. Kabul, once relatively insulated, began to feel the war within its walls. For Afghans living in the capital, the sense of safety eroded as smoke rose from explosions that shattered both bodies and the illusion of security. The message was clear: no place was beyond the Taliban's reach. At the same time, the Taliban expanded their role as a shadow government. In districts where the state was absent or distrusted, they collected taxes, settled disputes, and enforced their own codes of conduct. Farmers who paid Taliban taxes often did so not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. To refuse meant retaliation, to comply meant survival. Their courts, harsh and unforgiving, nonetheless offered something Kabul often could not: speed and consistency. Foreign forces sought to counter this by training Afghan security forces. Police units and the national army were expanded rapidly, but their ranks were plagued by corruption, desertion, and inexperience. In many areas, police officers demanded bribes or abused their authority, eroding the very trust they were meant to build. Some even sold weapons or intelligence to the Taliban. For villagers caught between abusive officials and strict insurgents, the distinction between ally and enemy blurred. Night raids became another hallmark of this period. Special forces descended from helicopters under cover of darkness, storming homes in search of Taliban commanders. Sometimes they succeeded, capturing or killing high-value targets. Other times, mistakes led to the deaths of civilians, an elder mistaken for an insurgent, a child shot in confusion. These errors, amplified through rumor and memory, fueled anger that the Taliban readily exploited. Despite the overwhelming power of NATO, the war was not won in battlefields, but in the slow grind of perception. Each destroyed convoy, each assassinated official, each failed development project reinforced the Taliban's message that foreign powers would eventually leave, but they, the sons of the soil, would remain. Ordinary life in these years carried the weight of uncertainty. Farmers planting wheat scanned the skies for drones. Children walking to school eyed the road for hidden bombs. Women navigating checkpoints endured searches from soldiers who did not speak their language. Yet life continued. Bazaars buzzed with trade, weddings filled villages with music, and prayers echoed through mosques, as if to remind Afghans that survival itself was a form of resistance. By the early 2010s, the toll of the war was staggering. Civilian casualties mounted year after year. Entire families fled to refugee camps, some within Afghanistan, others across borders. A generation grew up knowing nothing but war, their childhood marked not by toys and games, but by the sound of helicopters and gunfire. For foreign troops, the war became a cycle of patrols, losses, and rotations, with no clear measure of success beyond survival. And yet, through all this, the Taliban endured. They could not seize Kabul outright, but they did not need to. Their strength lay not in grand offensives, but in attrition, in being unkillable by refusing to die as an idea. They were no longer merely fighters in the hills. They were administrators, judges, smugglers, recruiters, and above all, patient. They were waiting for time to erode the will of their enemies. It forces one to reflect. When war becomes a contest of patience, does victory belong to the side with the most weapons, or to the side most willing to wait a generation? By the mid-2010s, Afghanistan had become a landscape defined less by geography than by decades of continuous conflict. Foreign troops had poured in, filling bases, patrolling highways, and attempting to govern through Afghan proxies. Billions in aid had flowed into reconstruction projects, yet the countryside remained a patchwork of contested territory. Amid this complex web of influence, the Taliban quietly waited, adapting to every shift in strategy, every political maneuver, every surge of troops or withdrawal of attention. The death of key leaders, through drone strikes, special operations raids, or targeted attacks, did not break the Taliban. Leadership structures proved resilient, often decentralized, allowing local commanders to continue operations even when top figures were eliminated. The Quetta Shura and other hidden councils ensured continuity, funding, and recruitment, while commanders in provinces managed day-to-day operations, exploiting local grievances against Kabul and foreign forces. By 2014, international forces began withdrawing. The United States officially ended combat operations, leaving a smaller contingent of trainers and advisors to support Afghan security forces. NATO gradually transferred control of provinces to Afghan authorities, creating a vacuum the Taliban were quick to exploit. Districts once governed by Kabul's representatives fell back under shadow Taliban control, as the insurgents leveraged their long-standing networks and knowledge of local terrain. The Afghan government, weakened by corruption, inefficiency, and infighting, struggled to maintain legitimacy. Elections were held, but voter turnout was low, and reports of fraud undermined public confidence. Police and military units were underpaid and under-equipped. Meanwhile, the Taliban capitalized on their reputation as enforcers of justice, however strict, offering a contrast to a government perceived as distant and ineffective. In rural areas, villagers often faced the practical reality. Cooperating with the Taliban was safer than relying on a government that might not even reach them. During these years, the Taliban adapted their tactics further. Suicide bombings, targeted assassinations, and complex ambushes became increasingly common. Roadside improvised explosive devices remained their most effective weapon, striking fear into supply convoys and patrols. They also expanded information campaigns using video messages, social media, and propaganda to recruit, intimidate, and persuade. Their narrative emphasized foreign occupation, corruption, and the idea of restoring Afghan sovereignty under strict Islamic governance. Even as conflict persisted, daily life continued in the shadows of war. Farmers tilled land that might be next to a Taliban stronghold or an Afghan army checkpoint. Children attended schools that were periodically closed due to security concerns. Markets operated under the constant threat of attack. Women navigated a complex landscape, balancing Taliban restrictions with the opportunities and risks offered by post-Taliban reconstruction. Survival required vigilance, adaptability, and sometimes silent complicity. Efforts at peace talks began intermittently. Diplomatic channels opened in Doha and elsewhere, seeking to negotiate terms that could stabilize the country. The Taliban insisted on recognition and guarantees that aligned with their ideological vision. Kabul, often under pressure from the United States and NATO, sought agreements to reduce violence. Yet trust was minimal, and negotiations frequently stalled. For ordinary Afghans, these discussions were distant echoes. Their reality remained dictated by checkpoints, roadblocks, and the threat of sudden violence. The final years of foreign presence were marked by increasing insurgent control. Despite advanced military technology, air support, and intelligence capabilities, NATO forces struggled to suppress the Taliban completely. Every offensive was met with local adaptation, retreats into the mountains or border regions of Pakistan, and eventual re-emergence. By the late 2010s, it became evident the Taliban had not only survived but endured, refining a strategy that relied as much on patience as on force. In 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed an agreement aimed at reducing violence and facilitating the withdrawal of foreign troops. This marked a turning point. The Taliban were no longer a purely insurgent force. They had become a political entity capable of negotiating with global powers. The Afghan government, weakened and increasingly isolated, struggled to assert authority. Rural districts remained contested, with the Taliban's shadow administration continuing to operate quietly yet effectively. When foreign troops completed their withdrawal in August 2021, the Taliban returned swiftly to Kabul. The speed of their advance stunned much of the world, but was rooted in 2 decades of preparation. They relied on networks built over years of insurgency, exploiting weaknesses in government forces and capitalizing on the population's war weariness. Key provincial capitals fell with minimal resistance, and by mid-August, Kabul itself was under Taliban control once more. The human stories during this return were deeply complex. Some Afghans welcomed the Taliban, hoping for stability after years of war. Others fled in fear, particularly women, journalists, and minorities who had gained relative freedoms under international oversight. The capital saw dramatic scenes: foreign embassies evacuating staff, chaotic crowds at airports, and a mixture of resignation, hope, and panic among citizens. Reflecting on this century-long arc, the Taliban's story is one of adaptation, endurance, and resilience. They rose from students and fighters to rulers, were overthrown, survived as insurgents, and returned to power. Their trajectory illustrates not just the effectiveness of military tactics, but the profound influence of local knowledge, tribal networks, cultural loyalty, and patience. They survived because they adapted to both geography and society, and because they leveraged failures and weaknesses in their opponents over time. And so, the question that lingers for history and for anyone observing is this: when a movement is embedded so deeply within the social and geographic fabric of a nation, able to endure defeat, adapt tactics, and reassert control, is its return inevitable, or does the trajectory reflect the choices and miscalculations of every external and internal actor over decades? The Taliban story is not only a tale of ideology and conflict, it is a story of human endurance, of a nation caught between foreign intervention, insurgency, and the relentless pursuit of survival amidst centuries of upheaval. Afghanistan's history, marked by resilience and repeated cycles of struggle, offers lessons that resonate far beyond its borders. Power is rarely permanent, but adaptation, patience, and local knowledge can make it enduring, even in the face of overwhelming force.